Passover Seder is, in essence, a play that's done in a home. We use a script, which is called the Haggadah. We have props, which are the symbols for Passover, and family and friends get together and they experience the travel from Egypt into freedom, from slavery to freedom. It says in the Passover Haggadah in the book that we need to each feel as though we ourselves have gone from slavery to freedom. We try to do that in story during the Passover Seder, the first night of Passover. The purpose is for each of us to feel as though we have left servitude. And the message of freedom is the essential message. So when Jesus says, "This is my body and this is my blood," what Jesus is saying to his followers, you will be eating me as the sacrifice. And in eating me, I will become a part of you. And I will be that message of freedom and liberation that you will experience. Because both Jesus and his disciples knew about that message of freedom and liberation, which is the essential message of Passover.
The Apostle Paul calls Jesus our Passover lamb. And it's important to recognize that the Passover lamb was not a sacrifice for sin. That happened on Yom Kippur. The Passover lamb was a sacrifice to remember God's deliverance and the freedom that God gave. And so that was the theme of that service, of that meal that night. And every time the Passover is celebrated, it is a drama, it is a play that's reenacted to take people back to that moment in time and help them remember what God has done for them. And for us, you'll recall that Jesus transforms the Passover Seder into the Christian Holy Communion or Eucharist. For us, this is a drama, a play in which we become actors and we are taken back to that moment so that every time we receive Holy Communion, we remember what Christ has done for us and we become a part of the story. Now, the theme then of Passover is liberation. It's freedom from slavery. But we might well ask, well, what kind of slavery were the disciples caught up in that they needed to be set free? And for ourselves, 2,000 years later, what are we enslaved by that we need to be made free from? And to understand that, we turn to the disciples around the table. And I want you to understand what was happening here. Jesus comes to this meal, and his heart is heavy because he knows within a few hours he'll be betrayed, arrested, the disciples will leave him, and then he'll be taken for trial and finally crucifixion. But the disciples, they don't get it. They're totally oblivious to this. And you know what they're discussing at the table? They're actually across the table, they're debating among themselves. Luke tells us in Luke chapter 22, verse 24, a dispute also arose among them, listen, as to which one of them was to be regarded as the greatest. Can you believe that? Jesus is getting ready to die and they're debating which one of them is the greatest. And you know, every time I start to feel sort of bad about my own Christian life, like I don't get this right, many times, all I have to do is go to the Gospels and read the stories of the disciples. It always cheers me up a bit. I always feel like, at least I wouldn't have been sitting at the Last Supper debating which one of us was the greatest. Or would I? Let me let you in on a little secret. Get a group of pastors together. Have a little pastors meeting. You know what they talk about? Here's the question. So how many do you have coming in worship? How big is your budget? How many employees do you have? How much do you pay in apportionments? How big is your missions giving every year? What are we doing when we're asking those questions? We're trying to figure out which one of us is the greatest, aren't we? It's all about position and status and pride and importance and self-importance. And I'm guessing pastors are the only ones who do this, right? Actually, I know that's not true. And so for all of us, we struggle. Underneath all of this is pride. And the disciples were enslaved by it. Otherwise, they wouldn't be talking about it at that time. They couldn't help themselves. And we find ourselves in the same place where we're so concerned about status and what other people think about us and where we fit in the pecking order and making sure that people's impressions of us are just so and wanting to know that we're important, that we're somehow better than others. We find ourselves enslaved to this, and there are all kinds of things we're willing to do to win over the hearts and minds of other people to believe that we're the greatest. Now, it wasn't just the disciples or these disciples that were having this conversation. There was another factor, another kind of slavery that was at play that night, and that was seen in the one disciple who didn't enter into the conversation. In fact, it was sort of strange. He didn't really talk that night at all. When he walked in the room, everybody noticed he seemed a little nervous, a little anxious. If you looked carefully, you noticed that that his upper lip, there was perspiration there. He seemed like he was ready to get out of this place. His name was Judas. Now, Judas, just hours before, had gone to the chief priests, the religious leaders, and this was the question he asked them: how much will you pay me to turn him over to you at a time where there's no crowds there? How much? Come on, how much? And they said, in today's dollars, $10,000. He said, sold. I'll give him to you for $10,000. And of course, we know after the supper, Judas betrayed Jesus to the religious leaders and their temple guards. Why? Why did he do this? That's the great question that Christians have wrestled with over the centuries. And some have suggested, well, he was trying to force Jesus' hand, and I don't find that a very compelling argument. But two arguments that I do think are pretty compelling. The first has to do with Judas's political ideology. Judas, I think, was likely a zealot. He was one who believed that the Romans needed to be thrown out of the land and that the kingdom of Israel needed to be reestablished as it was in the days of David and Solomon. And so he was looking for a Messiah, a king who would overthrow the Romans. And as he was doing that, he saw Jesus and Jesus' capacity to inspire a crowd, to electrify them. And he thought, here's the one. And that first year, he gave up his career, he gave up everything to begin to follow Jesus, and he followed him, and he was a bit perplexed by Jesus and what he was saying, but he thought, well, he's building the coalition of the willing to go with him to overthrow the Romans. And yet, by the second year, he became confused, because Jesus wasn't talking about how to slit the throat of the Romans. He was telling them that that when the Romans asked you to carry their baggage for a mile, you carry it a second mile. When they strike you on the cheek, you turn the other cheek. That you're to love your enemies and to pray for those who persecute you and do good to those who wrong you. And Judas was just confused. But by the time Jesus was coming into Jerusalem, Jesus had begun talking about his own suffering and death, and Judas finds himself thinking, you know what, I'm not going to die with this man. No, I'm not. I didn't sign on for this. In fact, I didn't sign on for this at all. And Judas decides that he's going to cut his losses, and in the process, he's going to figure out, can I get anything for the last 3 years of my life? Well, $10,000 is something. What would you be willing to do for $10,000? If somebody were going to write you a check right now? How much would you be willing to compromise your faith? To sell out what you believe in? $10,000 is a lot of money. So on the one hand, we have Judas, who has a political ideology, and his political ideology is violence to overthrow the Romans. Jesus is love, which ultimately transforms the entire Roman Empire. And Judas has to decide, do I love my political ideology or Jesus? You know, we find ourselves in a similar situation sometimes today. I have very strong political opinions, so do you. And you know, sometimes my political opinions don't necessarily line up with what I see Jesus teaching in the scriptures, and I have to decide, which do I love more? My political viewpoints or the teachings of Jesus? Sometimes that's a struggle. Sometimes what we want to do is we want to make Jesus into what we are, and so we sort of force him to fit into our mold, as opposed to saying, you know what, my task is to fit into his mold. And here's the thing, you know this already. Jesus, he was not a Democrat, and he was not a Republican, and he was not a libertarian. He didn't perfectly fit any of those molds, although there were pieces of each of them that probably fit his character and his ethics. And so the question we have to ask today is, you know, when there's a conflict between our political ideology and the teachings of Jesus, which do we follow? Because Judas decided it was his politics. But there was also this matter of money for Judas. And we read in John's gospel that Judas was the keeper of the money for the ministry, you know, for the group, for the disciples. And John tells us that from time to time, Judas would help himself to the money. And the very fact that he offered to sell Jesus out, he went to try to get money for this betrayal, tells us that money was really important to him. He wanted just a little bit more. So we find that Judas was enslaved to political ideology and to a desire for wealth. And thank God none of us ever struggle with those things, but Judas struggled with those things. And really the question I would ask you is, what are you enslaved by? What is it that has become for you the most important thing in your life? It rules everything else. That leads you to do things that are maybe in Maybe it would lead you to compromise your faith because this thing matters most to you. Is it what other people think about you? Is it status or position or power or money or political ideology? Because none of those things really can compete with Jesus. So Jesus came to set them free. He came to offer liberation to the disciples, and not just to the disciples, but to all who would follow him over the centuries. But how does that happen? What does he do to offer us liberation? Well, he points in this direction in two different ways at what he does at the Last Supper. And the first thing he does is the disciples are debating over here which one is the greatest. Jesus doesn't say anything. He doesn't say a word. He just gets up from the table, and he walks over to the door, and they're all watching him. And he picks up the basin and the pitcher. And you know what? They are mortified because they know exactly what he's going to do. And he walks over to the table, and he comes to the first disciple, and Jesus, the Savior, the Master, he takes a knee. And he takes that disciple's feet, and he begins to wash them. He doesn't say another word. He just goes to the next disciple and takes the feet and begins to wash them. And one by one, Jesus goes to each of the disciples. And finally, he looks at them and he says, "Do you understand what I have done for you? I've spent 3 years with you and you don't get it still. I've taught you the true greatness is found in serving, that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Don't you get it yet? Freedom is found not in trying to impress other people and convincing them that you're really something. Freedom is found when you find yourself saying, my life is about blessing, not being blessed. It's about serving, not being served. It's about giving, not receiving. And in the process of doing that, you find yourself free." I was reading this week the story of the CEO, founder and former CEO of an American airline company. And it was said that whenever he flew on his own airplanes, he would always wear the clothing of the flight attendants. He donned a flight attendant's uniform, and he would pass out peanuts and soft drinks, and he'd clean the toilets if they needed to be cleaned. Just out of curiosity, do you think the employees for that airline respected him more or less because he did that? How about the customers who were buying their tickets on the plane? Do you think they respected him more or less because as the CEO and founder, he was actually doing the work of a flight attendant? And you know the answer. That people had greater respect for him, not less, because he took the role of a servant on the planes. Greatness is found in serving. And you know, when you do that, you find yourself free when you're no longer in a position where you're trying to impress other people. All right. Well, the second thing that Jesus did is how he positioned people around the table. And we talked about this last Lent, but I want to remind you of this. How he positioned people around the table. Now, let me just set this up by saying, how do you deal with somebody who's betrayed you? Because Jesus knew that Judas had betrayed him. How do you deal with it? I remember years ago when one of our daughters came home from school, she was probably 11 or 12, and she said that her best friend at school had stabbed her in the back. And she said, I will never, ever, ever, ever be a friend to that person again. How do you deal with it when somebody's betrayed you, stabbed you in the back, hurt you? This last week, we saw two different examples of the worst way that people do this. A biology professor in Alabama who didn't receive tenure. And she allowed that to eat at her and to eat at her and to eat at her until she showed up at a department meeting with a gun and shot 6 of her colleagues. Or a man in Austin, Texas, who continued to allow the anger to boil over at what he perceived as the unfair treatment by the Internal Revenue Service. And finally, he got in his airplane and flew his airplane into the IRS building in Austin. I would never do anything like that, I don't think, but you know how I deal with it when somebody hurts me? I give them the silent treatment. I just don't talk to them, and hope that they get it after a while. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. And I'll tell you, that's a really stupid way to deal with conflict. But that's how I deal with it sometimes. Here's how Jesus dealt with it. Actually, let me just set it up, how he dealt with it. First, let's remember how the Last Supper is usually portrayed in our minds, and that was by Leonardo da Vinci. So we've got the picture here. Right, now let me just mention that Da Vinci got almost everything wrong about the Last Supper. It happened after sunset, and you notice it's daylight outside. It was the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Everybody knows that, but he has leavened bread on the table. The table, you see how high it is, and that was not at anything like the tables that they ate at in the first century. And even the positioning of the disciples. Now, maybe